Good morning. Oh. Well, I do wish you a good morning. The second day of our conference, and we got off to a wonderful start yesterday. And we have some repeat performers here on our panel this morning. Just to let you know you're in the right place. This is the session on Europe's far right. Is it growing, evolving, or returning? Is it mirrored in the United States? So we'll do a bit of comparative analysis, I hope, during the course of the session. I'm Ray Arsenault. I'm the chair of the History and Politics Department here at USF St. Petersburg. And let me introduce the panel. We've got a wonderful panel for you this morning. And we'll get going. Same format this morning. They'll be passing out cards for questions, and we'll try to save some time. We actually originally had 4 panelists, and one person, I believe, snowed in Washington. So again, reinforces what paradise we live in here in St. Petersburg. Our first panelist to my immediate left is Pierre Kinane. He's a professor of American Studies at Université Paris-Ouest Nanterre. His fields are U.S. foreign policy. We just discovered, I can't believe I saw him up here yesterday at one of the panels, and we were at a conference together in The Hague last year, and I knew he looked strangely familiar, but I know I can't know that guy. But anyway, he's a very distinguished scholar of international studies, focuses on, in some cases, anti-Americanism, the image of the United States abroad. So we're very pleased to have him here. To his left is Richard Miniter, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the American Media Institute. He's an award-winning investigative journalist, New York Times best-selling author. He's been at this conference before. He writes the national security column for Forbes.com. He's a very prolific editorial page op-ed writer, and very, very well known in international relations, foreign policy circles. Our third, to the far left, is you got to have far left on a far right panel, all right? Is Albert Wieringa. He's a native of the Netherlands, but he's lived in St. Petersburg since 2002. He currently writes for the Dutch newspaper, De Telegraaf, and the Belgian periodical Laatste Nieuws. I'm sure I'm mangling that pronunciation. And he also has a great kind of background in sports. He's officially a grand national athlete of the Netherlands. So Hans Brinker in the Silver Skates, I guess. And now we know who we are. Since we're one panelist down, I might just take a moment to provide just a little bit of context. They asked me to do this about the far right, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists. We're dealing primarily, of course, with a contemporary situation, but I think it's never a bad thing to get some historical context. And on the far right, just tell you just 2 brief stories. When I finished my PhD thesis, had my defense, and I was all very excited. I finally had my official union card to become a professor, and my dissertation was on Southern demagogues, essentially sort of the far right of Southern politics and the wild and woolly characters from the backwoods in the early part of the 20th century. And so my dissertation director was very nice, and he had a little reception for me at his house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And lo and behold, I walk in there, and there's a man, may not be known to all of you, but in the world of history of ideas, Frank Manuel is a kind of a superstar. He's written a lot on Marxism, and he was a close associate of Herbert Marcuse's The History of Ideas. And so I was immediately intimidated. I sat down next to him and sipping my drink, and he asked me, well, congratulations, you successfully defended your thesis. What was it all about? Well, I said something like, I'm not sure what I said, but I mentioned the far right and the far left. And he looked really puzzled at me. And he said, you know, I don't know what that means. A far left, far right, all I know is up and down. What do you think? And I stammered through it, you know, without spilling my drink on him, I guess. But that always stuck with me, that he was one of the great kind of theorists of political philosophy. And he was admitting that he had no idea what the real hard and fast distinction would be right and left. Another experience I've never forgotten, I was a Fulbright professor in France in 1984-85, and I was at a conference in Normandy, in Caen. And at that time, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who I'm sure will get some mention today, leader of the Nationalist Party in France, was getting a lot of attention. He's dead now, but his daughter, of course, he's not dead. Oh, that's a shame. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. He's neither dead nor dying. His daughter threw him out of the party. Okay, well. That's so funny. Well, anyway, remember that thing on Saturday Night Live? General Elizabeth Franco is still dead. Well, John Le Pen is still alive, I guess. But anyway, I was in Caen, and at that time, they were militating against, of course, immigrants, particularly North African immigrants. And there was a movement in the schools and the universities. They had put up buttons that said, "Ne touche pas mon pote," which meant "don't touch my buddy," meaning that there was kind of solidarity across ethnic lines. It was kind of a counter against. So I was thinking, what a wonderful thing. Maybe there's really hope for France that they're doing this. And I was walking down the street and I saw this incredibly brutal episode where this obviously North African person was being beaten, thrown out of a bar, and he's being pummeled by these people right in front of me. I'd never seen anything quite like it. And I must say I was surprised. I might expect something from the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. This is my first kind of direct contact with, I guess, the equivalent of a French Klansman. Never forgotten that experience. Let me just say very briefly, political theorists, political philosophers, historians have a great difficulty in making precise judgments about what is right, what is left, what is center. I'm sure, as you know, when we think about the right, the words that come to mind are order, power, control, and of course we have long traditions of authoritarianism in Europe and other parts of the world, and of course in the 20th century we've seen the emergence of totalitarianism, a kind of complete control of the state. That's about as far right as you can get, although to confuse things we have an authoritarian left, which morphed into a police state in the Soviet Union, so it's hard to know whether that's left or right in the end. I'd say just to set the mood here, in the United States, we don't think in those terms. What we've had is a very strong tradition of what we call right-wing populism. Ever since the Federalist Party was knocked out in the election of 1800, and then of course Alexander Hamilton was killed in the duel by Aaron Burr, there's never really been a major party that admitted that it represented the elite. They certainly have represented the elite, but you really can't be open about it. All parties in the United States have to claim to be populistic, to represent popular sovereignty and the will of the people. And the people that I wrote about in my first book, these so-called Southern demagogues, were very difficult to classify. And I think in the end, what I argued, rightly or wrongly, is that most of them, here we're thinking of Huey Long and George Wallace and Lester Maddox and the Talmadges in Georgia, and many others. Yeah. Well, so many demagogues, so little time, kind of the Dixiecrat types, that many of them were more interested in politics than government. They'd rather run for office than hold office. The excitement for them was going and making the incredible stump speeches out in the cane breaks. They were sometimes called cotton patch fascists. Cotton patch fascists. And I argue that that really was an incorrect designation, that they didn't really, with rare exceptions, have any theory of the state. They weren't arguing for statism. They wanted personal power, personal factionalism, but they were very different than Mussolini and Hitler and Franco. They never really got to that point. And there's a huge debate among American historians and political scientists about whether there's something about American life that somehow our society, our culture is so chaotic, it's so multicultural, that there's something about our system that prevents that kind of national level fascist or Nazi like regime. We'll see about that, of course. This is Sinclair Lewis, the great novelist, wrote a book in the 1930s saying it can happen here. He was sort of countering that tradition. So maybe that's a discussion that we'll get into today, and maybe even talk about some of the people who were on the debate stage last night. If you saw the town hall meeting in Greenville, South Carolina, with Ted Cruz. So I'll say no more. But we'll start with Pierre, and we'll go from there.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, and of course you stole my thunder because half your presentation was initially an anti-mine. So I'm going to have to try to be inventive and be a repeat performer, but not a repeat offender. As a companion piece to It Can't Happen Here, there's a very interesting novel by Philip Roth called The Plot Against America, where he imagined that it did happen in America. This is the world of fiction. But now we're going to move away from fiction and go to the far right in Europe. And of course, it's much easier to know what is right and what is wrong than what is right and what is left. Because as you mentioned, Stalinism ideologically came from the left, but was it really left-wing? So these categories can be very blunt. In Europe, the far right, or I think it would be a good choice of words to say, right-wing demagogues are on the ascendant. They're often associated with fascism in the past. Although the word fascism, which is apt when you talk about Italy, even when you talk about Nazism in Germany, it's problematic. Or authoritarian governments, undemocratic movements. They're usually based upon an ideology whose core is anti-immigrant, nationalistic, militaristic, xenophobic. In the past, anti-Semitic. In the present, there are remnants of anti-Semitism in some countries. But in many places, anti-Semitism has been replaced by racism towards Arabs, sometimes called Islamophobia, which is a somewhat problematic term. We can talk about this in the discussion in the question and answer session. So yes, the far right undoubtedly is on the rise in Europe, but there are important national differences according to the countries. I'll talk about France in a minute because I think it's very worrying in France. But in Germany, for example, you have a movement called Pegida, and a political party that they call Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland. They are far-right parties, xenophobic, nationalistic, and they're particularly strong in the former East Germany, but they're not close to power. There's no danger right now that these movements will come to power, whereas the National Front in France could seize power. Now, the National Front was led by somebody called Jean-Marie Le Pen, the man Eric thought he was dead, but he's not dead, he's 80-something. He practiced torture in Algeria. He makes anti-Semitic jokes and so on. His party is now led by his daughter, who kicked him out of the headship of the party. And she has mostly the same ideas, but rhetorically, she decided, under the influence of a companion or partner, not to use anti-Semitic language, and on the contrary, to try to woo some far-right Jewish organizations. So she rubbed the anti-Semitism, but she's remained nationalistic, anti-European, anti-immigrant. And there is a real danger that the National Front could achieve either power at the national level or power at the regional level. In other countries, the far right, which calls itself the right, has come to power. Poland, I'm sure you've read articles about Poland. The right, but basically they are the far right. They came to power. What they're already doing in Poland is they're trying to abolish the rule of law. They constitute the equivalent of the Supreme Court. And Europe, the EU, seems to be very soft in dealing with Poland. But they are anti-immigrant, anti-refugees, homophobic. And in Poland there are remnants of anti-Semitism which are now erased, they're not part of the conversation. But you have a far-right party in power, not respecting the rule of law and European rules. In Hungary, same story. And the guy Orban, Viktor Orban, who is the leader of Hungary, was celebrated as a liberal fighting communism. He studied in Britain, and now there's a typical anti-European, anti-immigrant, xenophobic attitude, and he's in power. Now, these are not totally new phenomena, because somebody like Berlusconi in Italy did not officially belong to a far-right party. His party, Forza Italia, though was a demagogic party. In Europe, people call this populist, but I think the word populist is slightly different in English from what it means in other languages. You can be populist and left-wing, but he was clearly a demagogue who he was called il buffone, that is the buffoon. And lots of people, Italian or American, make comparisons between Berlusconi and Donald Trump. And I think this is quite apt in reference to what was said before. Some of these demagogues do not really want to achieve power. Jean-Marie Le Pen was an anti-Semitic thug, practiced torture in Algeria, but he was also a buffoon who was not interested in reaching power, whereas his daughter is interested in reaching power. That is why she's far more dangerous, because she's slicker in rhetorical terms, and she's likely to achieve power. Berlusconi achieved power. He controlled the media, but his personal behavior was very outrageous. He lost power in a kind of European coup, and there were some democratic structures that stopped him from becoming a fascist in the traditional Mussolinian sense. In the UK, there's also a far-right party. And something which is interesting about the far-right is they don't want to be called the far-right or the extreme right. They claim to be traditional conservative parties. They call themselves conservative or just the right. So the label far-right is a label that all others apply to these movements, but that they reject. In Britain, UKIP is mostly an anti-European party. When the National Front wanted to form an alliance with UKIP, UKIP refused because they claimed that the National Front was too anti-Semitic. And the National Front is trying to project an image that is not anti-Semitic anymore. So in a way, there's some kind of hope there, because there's no far-right coalition at the level of Europe. These groups are so nationalistic that it is very difficult for them to form a real alliance, although they have a group in the European Parliament. And UKIP is mostly interested in the relationship between Britain and Europe, and what links UKIP with the other groups is they are anti-immigrant.